Hello, my name is Laura West. I am a Fulbright scholar and professor from both the United States, the Salisbury University in Maryland, and I'm doing a Fulbright scholar study at the University of the West with the Department of Art and Design. I am primarily a sculptor and a researcher working a lot with digital fabrication and 3D scanning. My project has brought me here essentially to help document a lot of the amazing artifacts and art that are here in Romania, as well as to teach digital fabrication. So what I'm going to give to you today is a little lecture on my feelings and my interactions with Brancusi, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history and the time that he was growing up and working in. I'm going to tell you a little bit about his work and how his work developed, as well as a little bit about his personality and his life. So Brancusi is an artist, as for sculptors especially. His work changed the way that we see artwork. There is a point in time before Brancusi and after Brancusi, and there is a change between the two. He was an amazing man, absolutely very, very friendly, very humble, very Romanian, a man who stayed to his roots. A lot of his work has connections here in Romania with, you just walk around and you can see where he got his ideas. He is an artist that is truly rooted in his past, and not just the recent past, but thousands of years of past, as well as setting the stage for the future. When you look at his work and you look at the work that has been dug up out of the ground here from thousands of years ago, you see a definite connection. The Thinker sculpture that we have in the museum in Bucharest, you can see the expressions and the emotion, and even his early work, there is that connection between the two. So I want to give you kind of a quick look at history, and that will help you to understand, one, how Brancusi changed things, and how Brancusi looked forward to the future. So what was going around him, essentially, within about the last 6,000 years of art history, there in Western sculpture, the goal has always been to refine an image to the point where it looks exactly like the real thing. So a quest for realism, a quest for making the most perfect representational sculpture, the most perfect representational artwork. In the late 1800s, there were a bunch of things in history that happened that changed that approach to looking at art. And one of the biggest ones was actually the invention of photography. When photography was invented, you had this machine that could duplicate reality perfectly. So it made artists ask the question, what can I give to the viewer that this machine, this photography machine, can't do? How can I add to the world? How can I add expression? It really altered the way that artists approached form. And it also actually approached the way that we saw form, because it captured form so perfectly. There were a bunch of innovations that happened too to start changing artwork as well. You know, one of the biggest innovations actually was synthetic pigments. When we discovered the ability to create pigments chemically, as opposed to going out, finding something that naturally had that color, grinding the color, adding the binders and the media to it. I mean, this is a process that took hours and hours and hours and hours. And most artists at that point ended up going through a long apprenticeship. A leading artist would have a huge crew of people helping him to prepare his paints, to prepare his canvases. When synthetic pigments came, you didn't need that whole huge crew of people. All you needed to do is to go down to the store and actually buy a tube of paint. It also made paint less precious, and it made the act of painting more accessible to artists that hadn't gone through decades and decades of training. And so then that allowed them to try new things. So the Impressionists were the first movement, and this is mostly the 1870s, 1880s. This is that point where the Impressionists would go out into nature and paint as opposed to gather ideas and sit in the studio and capture a moment in time, these impressions of color, the impressions of feeling. So something that was definitely a big shift from photography. So another thing that was happening at the time is European countries were at that last moment of going out and trying to colonize as much of the world as possible, which had good things and bad things about it, of course. You know, they're basically England, Spain, France, etc., all were going out and seeing and staking their flag down on the countries that all over the world. The one thing that was good for European art that was happening is many of the explorers were bringing back artworks from other countries, from Africa, from South America, from Asia, and seeing the way other cultures were creating artwork and expressing themselves essentially gave them a new way of looking at form. African masks were incredibly influential in early modern art, incredibly influential. Many of the early artists also were going out, like Gauguin going out to Tahiti and experiencing the culture. That one of the things that was kind of interesting about this point in time is art became more accessible to everyone. Like Gauguin, for example, was a banker, and he didn't go through years and years and years of training teaching you that art was only supposed to be done in this one way, that it only had one answer. It opened the doors up to have many, many, many answers, essentially. And so there were several movements around the turn of the century, the 19-teens, that were very influential, both to Brancusi and actually the entire world. The first really, really strong movement that happened was Cubism. So Cubism had several steps to get to the point where Picasso and Braque more or less invented this movement. And essentially what they were doing is taking and looking at the forms that were actually existing there and breaking them down into simpler, more geometric shapes and rearranging those geometric shapes, essentially trying to create a new way of expressing and looking at the world. This movement lit on fire all across Europe, and several other movements actually came from it. Picasso's earliest forays into Cubism, you know, he was still kind of simplifying the forms, and actually one of the things that happened for him is he went and saw this exhibition of African masks, and this is a really good example of other cultures influencing the way that you're working. And what you end up seeing here is where on this particular painting, the faces, there's several of them he did in his earlier style. He saw the African masks and then he came back and he repainted the faces to be more cubist and more abstract. And so that basically was the founding of that particular movement. You know, Futurism was a movement out of Italy that also kind of was influenced by this idea of Cubism. So Picasso started it, this wave happened and reached all the way, all across Europe. And essentially, the thing that changed there with Futurism, it was based on the idea of Cubism, but added the element of motion. And essentially, these artists in this period of time were very big on writing manifestos, where they're talking about using only new materials to represent a new age, where they're talking about how they're making new definitions of what beauty is. You know, one of the things in the manifesto, and this is essentially to kind of set the stage of where Brancusi was working and the environment that he was working in. These are actually some of the artists that he worked with as well. So with the Futurist Manifesto, one of the things that they talked about is how the idea of a racing car was more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace. So you have one of the most beautiful sculptures ever made, and yet this group of artists were looking towards the future so that they're thinking that the most beautiful thing actually is a racing car, much more beautiful than the human figure. It's a real shift in the way people are thinking. You know, they have in their statements, when you read their statements, you can really understand a lot of why things changed. You know, they talk about how you must smash and demolish and destroy the traditional harmony, to destroy the past, essentially. And they talked about how the idea that essentially, you know, people who weren't doing this were timid, and that they must disown the past and look to the future, essentially, because to forget means to be renewed. And so there was a huge rejection of the past among most of the artists at this point in time. Another thing that happened is artists started working more individually. So with the futurists, they're looking at machines and thinking about mechanical devices, and a lot of the work you'll see humans integrated with mechanical devices. Another thing that happened is there's this is actually one of Brancusi's close friends, Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp, they were incredibly close. So at this point in time, or prior to this, as a sculptor especially, you would have a huge studio of people working for you and actually creating your work. And often you were more like a conductor, guiding the person to do a little bit this way, to go this way, to go that direction. And with Marcel Duchamp, Brancusi's friend, he created this sculpture of a bicycle wheel on top of a stool. And basically, he before that was doing cubist, futurist work like the image on the top, which combined multiple images of one person into a single image. The nude descending the staircase is actually his most famous piece. So this particular bicycle wheel he made as a studio toy. Artists have like to move things with their fingers, and they're very tactile, and actually touching things really helps to let them think. And so he made this as a studio toy so he could play with it while he painted. And the critics came in and went, "Oh, wow, this is the most amazing piece of sculpture I've ever seen." And the rest of Duchamp's life, he was asking the question of what is art? What is it that makes something art? And so these are the discussions that he was having with Brancusi as well. And so things like the critics would go nuts over these objects that basically Duchamp would go out and buy and bring into the museum and change their context. And then the critics would come up with all these ideas, like the urinal laying on its side being something that was a beautiful feminine image and the likes. So the thing there with this particular piece is he actually just went to a plumbing store that was owned by R. Mott and Sons and bought the urinal, laid it on its side. When he signed it, he didn't sign it with his own name. He signed it with the name of the shop that he bought it from. So it's a real shift in thought of, okay, we can use apprentices, but why not use the industrial world as our apprentice? So in all of this environment, we have Brancusi, Constantin Brancusi, entering. And he is, of all the artists, the one who really strove to capture the soul of the form, not through precise, lifeless duplication, but through purification of the form. He was always talking about trying to capture the soul and the beauty of the form, to simplify it, and capture what it was to mean being a bird, or to being this particular person, or to capture this particular feeling. He was an artist that, unlike a lot of the futurists, he didn't reject the past though. He hung on to his past, which is very, very important for us now, because there was a point in art that the past was rejected so much that artists didn't know where to go. And some of Brancusi's ability to bridge the past to the future was really helped art come back to life after kind of hitting the brink. So with with his work. He was born in 1876. So that means he was 25 when all of this crazy stuff was starting to happen. He was born of a large family, and he actually kept running away. He ended up spending a lot of time apprenticing to mostly craftsmen. He spent a time working for a dyer, for example. He was really fascinated with potters, and he was really fascinated with carving and carving wooden tools. And so he eventually ended up apprenticing and working for a carver. And at the age of 18, he was working for carving tools and the likes. He created a violin from a wooden crate, which was so amazing because when he presented it, he actually brought a friend of his who played the violin and had them play it in front of an audience, and the person that played the violin said it was actually better than the violin that he owned. And that just his really brought attention to him and helped him get sponsorship to enroll in the School of Arts and Crafts. And he graduated 2 years later, essentially. And then one of the things that kept happening to him when he was working at the crafts school is his masters kept telling him that you're too good to just be a craftsman. You are truly an artist. You need to go study art. And so when he graduated from his craft school, he actually went to Bucharest, to the School of Arts and Crafts, the School of Fine Arts there. So at the age of 25, he studied at the University of Arts in Bucharest, and under the guidance of his mentors, one of the things that he created that was really incredible was this model of a human in a traditional Greek-Roman pose, but without any skin, just showing the muscles, life-size. There's actually still 4 copies of this original work that Brancusi did when he was 25 years old. This is in 1901, and the work that he did as a student is incredibly sensitive, incredibly beautiful. Just, you can see the roots of his desire to capture emotion and feeling within this early work right from the beginning. He had an absolute natural talent for actually duplicating reality, but also capturing emotion. So when Brancusi graduated from the University of the Arts in Bucharest, he was an artist that always wanted to continue growing, that he wanted to be better and better and better. He was always pushing himself to learn more. And so he felt like all these things were happening in Paris especially. So he felt like he needed to go to Paris and actually see what was really happening there with his own eyes. And the most amazing thing is he walked from Bucharest to Paris, almost all of the way. He did get very sick. It was a very, very hard journey, but he walked all the way to Paris. Now, my brother walked from South America, from Panama to Illinois, and it took him 4 months. And I can just imagine what that walk was like from hearing my brother's stories. And then at 25, the same age that he did his long walk, I did a long exploration, although I admit I used a car, of the United States. So there's something I think about taking that journey and that long walk that really helped cement him as an artist, and being able to spend all of that time alone while he was walking across the entire continent, essentially. It was a really great struggle for him to cross Lake Constance. He had to sell his watch, essentially, to pay for the ferry. And then he finally got to Paris, and he's surrounded with artists like Modigliani and Louise Bourgeois, and of course Pablo Picasso and Man Ray and his friend Marcel Duchamp and Henri Rousseau, many, many others. He is coming into this time where there's this confluence of just really amazing artwork that is happening. And his early work is really reminiscent of an incredibly famous artist named Auguste Rodin. Rodin is a representational sculptor who was more or less the king or emperor of sculpture at the time. And you can see a lot of the influence of Rodin in Brancusi's early work and the way he does his textures and his forms. And he actually ended up becoming Rodin's apprentice. You know, he wanted to go work for the best of the best of the best. And after only a month of being there, 1 to 2 months, it's said that he stood up in the middle of his crowd of apprentices and announced that nothing can grow underneath the shade of big trees. And he left. So at this point in time, if you were one of Rodin's apprentices, your goal was to make something that was so good that Rodin would come along and sign his name into it. And basically, and I've worked for a lot of other artists as well, I've worked for many artists where they'll give me an idea and some words and have me create something, and then they put their name on the work that I created. And that's a common thing of the time. It's still not uncommon at this day for an artist to use the resources of their apprentices. But Brancusi really saw that if he'd stayed with Rodin, he was not going to be great. He was not going to be able to grow and become his own artist. And so essentially, he started thinking about representational sculpture and looking at the sculptures in the gardens in Luxembourg and the Tuileries Gardens, where he'd talk about the sculptures were hanging with icicles, just freezing cold and dripping, and that there was no life to them. They're just frozen there. They're stuck there. And he says that essentially the only true art is art that will come from inside yourself. His time here, he started breaking away from Rodin. Brancusi started breaking away from Rodin and finding his own work. You know, the prayer is really the first sculpture. This is a sculpture that's actually back here in Romania. It was a commission for a cemetery. You can start seeing that he's beginning to play with simplifying the forms. He's being influenced by Picasso and simplifying and creating a much more expressive form. And he often would capture a theme and then follow that theme throughout his life. And so this head of a young boy leaning over, it's had titles like Asleep, it's had titles like Torment, it's had a few different titles, but essentially he's playing with the idea of youth and beginnings as one of the themes that he would repeat over and over again. And he's playing also with the idea of sleeping and waking up. It's this moment that we breathe and we come to consciousness that he's being very, very fascinated with. And at this point, when he left Rodin, his work becomes more or less the opposite of Rodin. Rodin would have this huge team of people and always leaving flaws and didn't, you know, he was very much so, very textural and almost kind of hands-off. Not that he didn't sculpt his own work, but he used a team. Whereas Brancusi, in contrast to Rodin, he would spend time working each surface intimately with his hands, doing all the work completely himself. He was involved with every single step of the process. His work also, he started moving towards simplifying the forms and simplifying the textures. And even in the early work, you can see the connection to his roots as a carver. He worked more as a carver than traditionally at this point. The early work was done in clay and then transferred into bronze and stone. But he very quickly switched just to carving and then possibly switching to stone. And you can see that with this playing with this sleep sort of waking youth theme, eventually the neck comes off, the eyes and the ears and the mouth become simplified. And in contrast to Rodin's very, very rough textures, everything is becoming incredibly smooth. This particular group is one of my favorites. First Step, First Cry, and Newborn, where he's really trying to capture youth. And that last one that he made in 1920, where you hear the child screaming and that mouth being open. It's absolutely magical. I mean, he's capturing that first moment of life. And this is a theme that he explored over and over and over again, trying to perfect it. And the final versions of these are The Beginning of the World, he titled, which actually that's a theme that I play with in my own work. And actually I play with the egg form as well. The Beginning of the World and the Sculpture for the Blind, where all the features get lost and it's purely just this really beautiful egg form. And it's absolutely exquisite. He's reduced and pared everything down to perfection. So Brancusi played with the idea of the kiss as well. So the kiss was a theme that played over and over and over again. And essentially, when he's trying to capture the kiss, he's trying to capture not the act of kissing, but what does a kiss mean? What does a kiss mean but two people coming together and becoming one person? When you look at Rodin's way of portraying the kiss, you have two people representational, they're very much enamored with each other, and it's a very sensual piece, but it's more about sex. Whereas Brancusi's kiss, you have two people coming together as one person, unifying as one being. They share the same eye. It's hard to tell which arm belongs to which figure, which one's male, which one's female. It's this idea, this perfect idea of unity. And he explored this theme over and over again, refining it, changing it, evolving it. The kissing column was kind of the beginning of the gate of the kiss. So again, I think the thing that's most important is to really think about not the image that you're seeing, but the image that it represents, because he's trying to pare things down and create this pureness in this image. So birds was another theme that he played with. His first birds were actually based on a Romanian folk tale where there's this golden bird that comes to life. And there's some really, really beautiful stories that you should certainly read about this bird. And so capturing what it means to be a bird is the thing that he would explore over and over again. And this evolved into him trying to capture a sense of flight. And the Bird of Space is one of the most truly amazing sculptures ever made. One, you have this sense, that you start from the base, and there's this sense of bringing you into this little tense point. Then the form explodes upward and it leads you off into the sky. So he's capturing that moment that that bird is taking flight. One of the things that I've only seen this portrayed really well at one museum, if the light hits the chest of that bird just right, you'll get rays of light coming off the chest like wings. Whoa. I mean, that's like one of those things that when you see that, you want to cry because you feel that flight so much when you see that work. There's an interesting story about the Bird in Space as well. When he shipped it to the United States customs agents looked at it and decided it was a mechanical device, and they wanted to tax it for being a mechanical device. Now, his friend Marcel Duchamp, the one that made the toilet, sent the United States the toilet, and it went through as a piece of art. But the customs agents wanted to tax this thing. And so there's a very famous case of Brancusi versus the United States, and he wins, with the help of Marcel Duchamp, the case and actually gets it declared as a piece of art. And this is also the first time in history in the United States that something legally is declared a work of art. It was actually pretty monumental if you think about it. So there is a series of works that are his absolute epitome in Tarju that is a monument that is across a kilometer of space to a group of people who more or less held the Germans off at the bend of the river. And they were a group of children and old men and old women holding them off with more or less pitchforks. I mean, they united together as one being and held off the Germans and protected the town. This group of totally not soldiers, kids essentially, held off the Germans. And so there was a move to make a monument to these people, these heroes. And Brancusi actually never took any payment for doing the work. Personally, he donated all of his time for making this work. And the very first work in this group is the Table of Silence, which is a large stone table which reflects, actually he would make all the furniture in his studio, and he had a large wooden table that was kind of like this, kind of a peasant's table. And he surrounded it with 12 stools. And he used a lot of symbols and numbers in his work, where numbers were symbolic. So the 12 stools, the connection to the 12 apostles, the 12 hours of the day. When he first put this piece up, he lined it up so that the stools were in pairs, almost exactly like the Stonehenge in England. And then he felt like he wanted all the people to be equal, so he spread them out so that they were absolutely equal in space. And this is supposed to be that moment before battle where you have dinner together, and eating together is something that's very, very important, and reflecting and gathering strength. And you can really, when you go to see the Dacian ruins, for example, there's this huge stone tables, and you can see that connection to the past that he always maintained within the work. Really incredible. And then you proceed from the Table of Silence to the Gate of Kiss. And the Gate of the Kiss is not about kissing. It's not about the act of kissing. It's a symbol. Everything he does are symbols. And so you have these two large pillars with the eye uniting together as one. And then across the lintel, you have a repetition of an outline of his sculpture of the kiss. And what this is symbolizing is the group of people coming together and uniting as one body to hold off the Germans. You have the large figures, the seniors and the children across the top, and essentially everything is coming together to be one body. It's how this group of people united as one being against the Germans. I mean, that's incredibly powerful if you think about it, and the way that he played with the symbolism. And even the circle with the vertical line through it, that actually is a mathematical expression of taking two forms that are completely different and uniting them as one force. So math is a really heavy part of the work that he creates as well. One of the things of my time of being here is you really only have to walk around to start seeing the influences of Brancusi. When I went to Tarjou the first time, I stopped at the St. Varvara Church, and I started crying because I saw these columns that were carved like the endless column. And it's, oh, that's where that idea came from. That's where that it comes from home. Being here has allowed me to really understand where his images came from more than I would have ever gotten in any other way. And it also has really showed me how, even though Brancusi spent most of his life in Paris, he stayed connected to his roots, absolutely paired with his roots. The endless column is the last piece in that series of work. And it's 29.3 meters, almost 30 meters tall. And he's playing with that repeated form. It was something that he started using as a base, and then he started playing with the columns themselves. By about 1919, the column itself was just a piece of sculpture. And what he wanted the endless column, the infinity column, to represent was that endless amount of gratitude that we should feel towards these people who protected the town. When you stand at the base and you're up fairly close to it, it looks like it goes on and on and on forever, that it doesn't ever stop. There's this connection of you on the ground and God in the sky, that connection to the infinity when you see this piece. Whew. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. This is actually his final work, which I find really interesting because this is connecting back to many different folk tales and the idea of our world being on the top of a turtle, the flying turtle. You know, so he's often connecting back to his history, even with his last and final works. He was an incredible, humble man who created all of the furniture in his studio, the archways and the doors. He dressed very humbly. He actually usually dressed in Romanian embroidered shirts, these really soft white pajamas. He walked around with a yellow cap on. He was very, very friendly and kind and always inviting people into his studio. He spent a lot of time with his friends. Here he's actually sitting with his friend Marcel Duchamp. And he would always have a pot of goulash on the stove to share. He was constantly cooking mamaliga and these really wonderful things to share with his friends. And they would spend a lot of time talking about art and what does art mean and what does it mean to make an art and how can we make art that will last for the future. You know, just the idea of being able to sit at the table with him, the conversations that he must have had were absolutely incredible. And he was always kind, he was always there, just a really amazing human being. You know, so many artists, when they start getting a level of fame, they start becoming above everyone else. And yet, Brancusi maintained this sense of humility. For me, getting to know him even more by living here and being in Romania has been, you know, one of the greatest experiences of my life. And he had a connection with his dog, even as I have a connection with mine. So the photograph here is him with his dog riding on a ship to the United States, and there's me here in Romania with my dog, exploring and learning and growing. I guess I actually want to say in conclusion, thank you for hosting me, Romania. Thank you all. I love this place so much that it has become my home. And you have so much to be proud of with Brancusi as part of your heritage. And now I feel like he's part of my heritage as well.